All right, we are live, and we were just discussing whether we would be just in time or exactly in time or whatever. So, welcome everybody who's listening in. Let's call this our first Lean Leadership Cafe. I'm here together with David Bovis and Bob Emiliani. Great to be with you guys.
Yeah, likewise.
Thank you, mate.
Happy to be here.
So, if you're live, joining us, let us know. There's a chat box nearby that you can put in this comment. So we can pick up on them and we can engage with your thoughts as well. I already got one here. Tim, welcome here. So how did this come about? Maybe a little introduction there. David, we met in 2018.
Yeah, I think so. Or maybe 17, yeah, around there.
First online and then later in real life. And
yeah, in Thetford Forest, with much fun with the kids.
And we ended up working together quite intensively the remainder of 2018. And today we will share some parts of our work together back then.
Yep, we do.
And Bob, I don't have a clue when we met. It must have been on LinkedIn.
Yeah,
probably many years ago.
Probably, I don't really recall. But we met in person for the first time last December and spent the day together and had a very good time together.
Definitely. We had such an exchange of ideas, and so that's bringing us further. So, and what's really bringing us together is that three of us, we all have a 20 plus years engagement with, should we call it lean or TPS or just continuous improvement. And we all three have experienced somehow that, hey, things we didn't understand, why are things progressing slow, or we have just been inquisitive of what's really going on, and is this what it's supposed to be? If I speak for myself at least, and I don't know if you would summarize it similarly, David or Bob?
Yeah, I think so, mate. Yeah, it's that we're all on the same page, we found out, but obviously come at things from different angles through different life experience, but bouncing things between ourselves. You know, me and Bob have also been in touch for years on LinkedIn, don't remember when, but shared bits and thoughts. We've written, sharing them backs and forwards and things. So, yep. And yeah, I think we've probably got quite an individual view of lean, you know, but it's one that we've all had success with by using it. So, yeah, and you know, looking to share that with others if it can help. So,
yeah, likewise, I spent decades studying TPS and lean, and then, you know, everybody has a realization at some point that things aren't going according to plan. There's a lot fewer lean transformations going on. There's a lot of misunderstanding about TPS and lean. Are they same, different, and so on. And so, in my case, the last dozen or so years, Andreas is calling in through Skype. Anyway, so for the last dozen years or so, I guess he didn't get your email, Emiel.
I don't know.
You know, trying to figure out what's going on. You know, why aren't we getting the results that we expected? And so to me, this is an enormous problem, and that's worthy of a lot of study. And other people have a different opinion about that. Just ignore the problem, and so we'll hope Andreas gets to.
I'm going to say I'm just nipping onto WhatsApp and sending him the link.
StreamYard, yeah. That was exciting, getting the Skype call.
Yeah, it drained a bit of your bandwidth, so you go away a little bit. So yeah, so I think we all three have our different perspectives there, and we have something in common that I think that we could quite a lot of more good in the world than it's currently doing, and we're just trying to progress that. Yep. So somehow it seems to be a good idea to get together and really start exchanging ideas. And which is, Anna, you have been seeing on LinkedIn and on other places. So, David, you have studied all kinds of stuff, among which psychology.
Yeah. I guess we can sort of we've got a few slides put together that we're going to run through, but we can jump around those a bit to make sure the conversation flows. Yeah, my realization came after I'd done a big lean project, and it's probably sort of the most intensive, all-encompassing lean project. It was Kanban, line-side delivery, whole kit and caboodle, massive stock down, exercise. And it worked brilliantly. Lots of 5S and completely redesign of the shop floor. VC company that owned the company was got rid of a big manufacturing bit and outsourced it, which didn't actually turn out too well because none of the drawings are up to date. So none of the parts came in right after they got rid of the intuitive knowledge of the people on the shop floor. But that bit aside, the rest of the project worked really well. And it was a real case study. And I went back a few years later to a couple of the guys that I'd worked with there, Sharon and Carl. And it all slipped. It all gone away. I'd moved on, and a guy called John that was working there as well, he had moved on. I think Vince from the States was coming over less, and it had all slipped back again. And it's this sustainability issue. It was about the time when people really started to have concerns in the market, sort of mid-90s, around the sustainability of what was then world-class manufacturing and becoming lean. And I turned around to these guys and said, like, wow, what happened? This was fantastic. We've done a great job here. And they said, oh, we never believed in all that old shit in the first place. And it was, for me, it was like, wow, this actually is not about the tools or the techniques. It's whether people believe in the tools or the techniques or the principles or the process. So, yeah, that set me off on a 20-year journey of education. And I started off trying to understand, what does it mean for somebody to believe something? So I started off with religion, because that's where the word's most commonly linked. And that took me into philosophy, and philosophy took me into psychology and neuroscience. And the more I understood about the science, the more I came to understand the Japanese mental models and the philosophy that had led to TPS, and how the tools had evolved because of the way people were being treated, and not because they'd been trained in the tools. And it became apparent to me there was this massive difference in the market, that we were trying to train tools and ignoring the philosophy, whereas the tools had evolved from the philosophy when it first evolved. And then I bumped into Lillian Gilbreth and what she had done with tabletop experiments and the influence over Japan's management thinking, and George Elton Mayo and his focus on relationships as an industrial psychologist, as well as Lillian Gilbreth. And I started to see the patterns in the words that weren't the words that the market was highlighting, but were there in people like Ono and Shingo. Shingo talked about Lillian Gilbreth and the brain being burdened and removing the brain burden. And Shingo talked about protecting people's precious energy. And then Yoji Ikao's design of... Yeah, I mean, Yoji Ikao's definition of Hoshin Kanri was inspired by the part of the philosophy that is about respect for people. It's about how do we do the best for people in terms of the way we deploy our strategy. So there's a much different driving force, I think, I found. So that's a long-winded answer to what you said, but that's what I went off doing for 20 odd years, just studying all that stuff. And like I say, the more I learned about it, the more management and leadership issues that I've been presented with as tangible, logical, rational, transactional, tools-based solutions all started to look really, really different to me. It's much more about imposed control and how, when you shut people's brains down by imposing control, you actually change the way the brain's functioning and where the glucose energy goes. So there's no capacity for innovation or continuous improvement. So, a lot of the management approaches and a lot of the training we do, the way we do it, the way it's approached, the way it's presented to the people that are on the receiving end, shuts them down. And we're asking them to become innovative whilst we're creating conditions that absolutely means they can't be. So yeah, that's kind of a part of the way I see the world these days.
So we have had many conversations in the past years.
We've been all through this a number of times.
I mean, we can talk about length about this. But today we will focus on the psychology part, isn't it?
Yeah, we're going to talk about the model that I come up with after all that study, the BTFA model.
We'll put it up there on our next slide.
Yeah.
Bob, somehow you started studying leadership. How did that come about?
Well, it was from the beginning when I was first learning TPS from Shingijutsu consultants. There was a number of us in the business unit. We reported to a general manager, and you could see how the different leaders at my level were learning or not learning from Shingijutsu, and so the variation in acceptance of what Shingijutsu was teaching was occurring right before my eyes. as our business unit, our small factory was trying to transform from batch and queue production to flow. And so I started to think a lot about this. I'd done some prior research and studying a lot about Eastern philosophy and leadership and organizational behavior, organizational development. And then this was happening. So I started to see things that were happening in relationship to other things that I had studied earlier in my work career to become a better team leader in a different job. And then I started to write about it. You collect these thoughts in the 1995-6 time frame and produce a couple of papers in 1998, one called Lean Behaviors, another called Continuous Personal Improvement, how I was applying lean principles or TPS principles and practices to my work as a leader and so forth, and some of the variation that I saw with others. So when I left industry in 1999, I chose as a topic for academic research lean leadership. So it really goes back to an interest in leadership starting in 1994, and then the TPS way of leading and the lean way of leading, and studying both of those and lean management and so forth based upon my industry experience.
Right. Yeah, and somehow, somewhere along the road, I started thinking about fellowship, and for the past 10 years, I have been. I've started with a tool focused approach as everybody else did, and in 2010, I came across Microtis work with Theo Kada, and I went full speed in that one. Somewhere along the road, I discovered it's a different and it's an additional dimension to the tools. Is focus on scientific thinking. I got the feeling there's still something missing, and I started diving deeper into cultural aspect of the other way. And then at some point I started reading Bob's books about leadership, and it was quite discouraging.
You're welcome.
Reality
bites.
And I said, okay, and if I get different inputs, something strange happens in my mind. I start looking at different angles. So I say, okay, if there's one leader, how many followers are there? And maybe there's an angle there as well that we can not properly investigated yet. So yeah. I think that's a kind of an introduction to the three of us and that people.
Well, that's a great example of how we've managed to find common ground to talk about in it, because I'm thinking about what's the psychological predisposition of a human being because of their past experience, and how do they respond as an employee to change that's usually imposed by a manager or leader, consultant, whatever else it might be, as they perceive it.
That, right?
Yeah, they might not see that it's imposed from on top, but from below, it's quite often feels like it's imposed. And and like I say, having come up from the shop floor as an apprentice, I had quite a few examples of having been on the tail end of that kind of imposition myself, and being very frustrated with external consultants coming in. It was common ground for us, I think, to talk about that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think the focus on followership is very an interesting one. Spent so many years looking at leadership, but there is things going on with followers that they're enabled or disabled from thinking certain ways or doing certain things. That's really worth exploring. So I'm very interested to do that with both of you.
Great that we can do that together. And to make a start with it, there's so much that we can talk about, but it seems to be a good thing to start off with a model that David created. It's called BTFA, which we'll get a short introduction shortly. And then we thought it would be a good idea for Bob to give an introduction to the three books that you see here on the screen. And then let's see how we can merge that and what we'll get out of that. So that's kind of the plan for today. So this is really about exchanging ideas and building our understanding of what's going on. And our plan is to do, we have been talking about doing this bi-weekly, but for now we only 2 more dates in the agenda. And we might invite guests later on. So if you're interested, let us know, and we'll explore this new venture together.
Mm-hmm.
Are you good, David, for an introduction to BTFA?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think to build on what we've just said, where the translation from Shinto to capitalism, let's say, has run into multiple barriers. Is that a politically correct way of saying it? I found clarity in science. The more I got into the scientific side of it, the easier it became to be able to explain and understand what it was I was seeing, and especially in terms of resistance to change. I know it's a term that a lot of people dismiss and don't like, but I just, I don't know, I got to a point where it all made sense in my head. The trouble is then you've got to try and not use very complex language that, you can talk about bromidioxide, uridine, cell tagging, and optical layering of brain cells and all that kind of stuff, and it just turns people off and loses them. So it's interesting for me to have understood some of that and built up the picture in my head. But the same way I think lean, TPS, whatever we're going to call it, ran into barriers because of the language and the translation, the same thing happens with highly technical subject matters and translation. So what we've tried to do, I think, independently with other business partners in the past, Ken, with yourself, Emiel, when we worked on this stuff together in 2018, try to keep pushing and pushing and pushing to get a more simple language around what is fundamentally neuroscience and psychology, around brains and minds. And because what we found is if you apply the psychology we understand, what we have to do is not trigger defense mechanisms at the first introduction, because otherwise people just make it wrong, blame you for being wrong, and do whatever they do to tell you that, the worldview that currently exists in their head is the right worldview, and any alternative worldview that challenges that is a wrong worldview. So what we try to do is get it really simple, and that simple. The model came out 10 years ago, BTFA, in my studying, but it's become a central feature in everything we do. So it's a simple start point for people to just get to understand why they might need to know a bit about brains and minds when it comes to leading lean or change or whatever else in business. So as you can see here, we've got a bit of a breakdown. And I'm not going to talk to the slide too much in terms of the bullet points. You can always pause the video when you watch this back and read those for yourselves. I want to just talk generally about it. So for me, a belief is the wiring in your head that's established through a process called neurogenesis, which means neurons grow, and we start off with like 25% neural mass when we're born. That becomes 85% by the time we're 3 or 4 years old. It maxes out at about 100 billion neurons, and then retracts back to about 86 billion through adolescence into adulthood. So we've got this infinitely complex wiring pattern in our brains, which is established by experience, and that we come to believe things about the world that we live in and the world we've survived because of that. It's that wiring pattern. What it does in terms of psychology and having a belief is that it's a pre-established pattern, and it allows us to take shortcuts, because what our brain's doing is always predicting what's going to come next to make sure we're kept safe in the world. So from a belief point of view, that's where the wiring comes into it, and the way the psychology evolves out of that. From a thinking point of view, it's the electrical, chemical, protein signals that go backwards and forwards up and down that wiring. And psychologically, that firing pattern within that wiring, we experience as inner dialogue, self-talk, metacognition, whatever you want to call it. So it's how it makes us think, and if we're thinking positively or negatively, all links into that prior formative experience. So whether we will go towards something or away from it, or like an introduction of a lean tool, whether we reject it or accept it, whether we feel like we can dominate something or submit to something, whether it's a leader or whatever else. So the thinking becomes really important. From my point of view, it's wiring and firing, okay? But it's just what we call beliefs and thinking and spurious language around it all. Feelings for me are chemical mix. So we end up with the activity in the brain triggering the release of chemicals, and vice versa, because this runs in both directions. We act in the world, that provokes emotional responses, that provokes us to think about things, and that informs the way the wiring changes in our heads. So it does go back the other direction as well. But the feeling bit is about how many chemicals are in the brain. And this is where it gets really interesting and where it becomes really applicable to what we are doing in business. because the emotional response we elicit in somebody will determine whether they accept new principles, lean tools, techniques, the training, the consultant, the new boss, whatever else it might be. So the emotional response is a key bit that needs to be considered, and then all of that is going on all the time in all directions whenever we're acting in the world. So how we act and react, our behaviours, that's what we have to be conscious of in terms of the behaviours and reactions we elicit in response to our own actions as leaders and as change agents or general managers or CEOs or whatever else it might be. So that's kind of how BTFA fits together for me and why it's important. And it gives us the capacity to start exploring a little bit deeper language around the fundamental mechanisms that sit at root cause of the people piece, so we've done root cause analysis of process and technology and systems, and wherever you go, we've got all the answers. Everybody's got a 9-step process or a 12-step process to problem solving. It's always about, the process is about solving the process. And then you say, okay, so the way you've just presented that has made that person go, I don't want anything to do with it. How do you understand how you've provoked that response? And there's no answers out there in the market. The best we get to is neurolinguistic programming or CBT or some of the pop psychology that came across from the States in the late 80s and things. But none of it's connected. So this is just an attempt to say, look, we have to understand human beings. And this is an easy bit of language, an easy model that we can start to think with, just to get the juices flowing in that direction, because we've ignored the people piece for so long. So that's kind of it, really.
And one of the, in my view, one of the strengths of the model is the starting point of believe. When I worked in industry, we were put through leadership development programs that had as their basis behavior results or produces the competency. And if you have a new behavior, you have a new competency. And that human resources, organizational behavior way of looking at things just ignored that people's beliefs were different. Yeah. And so the foundation, the buildup is belief, at least in their model, belief, behavior, competency. But they just presented it as behavior, competency. And so, yeah, this is far more complete and detailed and illuminating compared to the standard HR approach to leadership development.
Oh, thanks, Bob. No, but you're right. It was the same point that frustrated me. I started to look into this stuff whenever it was 15 years ago, and what was in the market was being heralded as the new innovative thinking, and people saying it's not just about this, it's about behaviors as well. And it was like, yeah, okay, so explain behavior. And there was nothing there behind it. It was just this starting point of behavior.
Any of those books you look at for HR competency models, you look in the index under B, nothing for belief, 0. They don't tackle it. They ignore it purposefully, or they're just unaware of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was my frustration. Yeah. And I think even to today, believe behavior is where people start to, and see that as an advanced approach to considering what's going on in an organization, to include behaviors as a consideration. Mm-hmm. And it's just, for me, it's just not deep enough. It really isn't. Right. And the more I've come to understand about the believe, think and feel part of it, the easier I've been able to understand behaviors and what's required to be able to, to define what is good leadership. You need to understand what is good for a human brain, so that you can understand what a leader's doing to provoke a response in the brain that's good for it or bad for it. If you haven't got that, how the hell are you supposed to know? We insist on this discipline at a process level. You have to be able to use, like Celerant or Barbara kind of rational, logic-based problem-solving mechanisms to say, if this, then that. And then we get to people and we go, oh, yeah, it's how they behave. And don't look into it. And it's just not deep enough. Mm.
I got a question here, David. Maybe.
Is it for Martin? I can see that.
Can you see it?
Yeah, you see the elaborating NLP one you're going to bring up. Yeah. So Martin's asked a question here. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right there, Martin. I'm not an NLP fan. Could you elaborate in why NLP is not a connecting technique when I understand you correctly? So NLP was a combination of cognitive behavioral therapies and hypnotherapy and psychiatry as well. And so again, it actually done a really good job, and it's really got some powerful stuff in it. The problem is, it's not that there's anything wrong with NLP per se, because some of the science behind it is right. It's just that it was a little bit earlier than neuroscience really came on stream, because I think neuroscience really started to take off when Elizabeth Gould got the Ben Franklin Award at the RSA presentation she made for her studies into neurogenesis and how experience influences the brain formation and things. So it was just a little bit earlier than that, and it didn't have the same degree of science behind it. And again, it was because it was being brought into a leadership belief framework that had no space for it, and so it was rejected as irrelevant by so many people. So there's nothing necessarily wrong with NLP. It does work, some of the treatments that come from it, and the way CBT and hypnotherapy and that kind of stuff combined. Some of it's a bit, hokum, but a lot of it's valid. But it wasn't the problem with the approach. The same as it's not the problem with lean. The problem was the language and the beliefs that rejected it and didn't allow it in anywhere. So it didn't actually find a platform. It's the same with soft systems modeling from a systems thinking point of view. That's such complex language. It's absolutely spot on. It says a lot of the same things I say. In many ways, but it just hasn't got the language register that allows people to engage in the first place.
Right.
So that would be, my answer to that question, Martin. Hope that answers it adequately.
And we'll get back to language later on, right?
Yeah.
So important. What's this sheet about?
Right, well, this is the summary. This normally, obviously, we're doing PDF, so we'll have to get you to go to the next one as well in a second. But really, it's the logical, rational, tangible, transactional mindset that we're classically conditioned to have. It really fits into the plan, do, check, act kind of, here's a sequence, here's a process to follow, and if you follow this process, you're going to get the results. But quite often in the process of following something like that, a set of steps that tell you do this, then that, then the next thing, what you're asking people to do is abide by the rules, which is compliance. And when people are told, psychologically telling is destructive, when people are told to do something, it quite often has a negative emotional response to it. So you find that you can get so far with a telling kind of approach, command and control, whatever you want to call it, and a logical process-based mindset, but that mindset can elicit the wrong responses. So what we're saying is understand that and understand what you've got to do different in how you go about doing process, and you can then get commitment, and commitment will take you a lot further in terms of performance than following process ever will. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there's no place for absolute strict disciplinarian approach, because you don't want people being innovative and pressing the wrong button in a nuclear power plant, right? Because there are processes there because you need people to be controlled sometimes and do the right thing. But not everybody works in a nuclear power plant, and most work environments you don't get the best from people if you take that approach generically. So because you can get performance, and you can get control, and you can get compliance, and you can have governance, and you can have all the things that tick a lot of boxes on a, as Bob says, a playbook or whatever else it might be, but it doesn't ultimately in the long run lead to the right culture. It doesn't lead to a high performance culture, because it doesn't engender a sense of psychological safety in the people that are involved. So it's good in its place, but I just think, and it's not wrong, but I just think there's more we can do, and that we can do things better. Yeah,
and even with a nuclear power plant, right? I mean, there's this the story about David McKay with this nuclear submarine, where he started focusing on the people just because he had to, and he inherited the worst craft that was in the worst vessel in the fleet, and within a year it became the best one, because he started working on the other side of didn't know about the BTFA cycle back then, but
yeah, that's a great case study. Days.
Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant for everybody to read if you want. So far, so good.
Yeah, good. Yeah, happy to move on.
All right. So that's a very, very brief introduction to BTFA. There's a lot more to it. Obviously, I see a questionnaire to compile a list of papers. probably, David, you have loads of papers. I don't know if you want to send them out, all of them. But
Carmen, wow, I could give you 10 years of stuff to read. I'll think of something and we could share it. Get you started somewhere. Perhaps we'll have a conversation at some point, Carmen, and then we can understand where you're at and what we can do to give you something to point you in the right direction.
Right. So maybe now is a good time, Bob, for you to give us an introduction about these 3 books that you wrote and what's behind it.
Yeah, so since about 2007, what I have been working on is to understand the preconceptions that leaders have that result in the way they run an organization, and then that has an effect on people. And so the main focus we'd like to have today, or result, is that we have some background information on how these preconceptions affect people in their work. And so what I've been interested in is what I call the institution of leadership, the social habits of mind. It means the social habits of mind, or the common thinking of a group, and how that then relates to lean management. And the overarching thing that I'm interested in is understanding what's really going on. We've had 3 decades of, let's just say, lean management and its variants going forward, and we haven't seen the results that we expected. We expected to see a lot more lean transformations and higher levels of business performance and so on, and we haven't seen that. So why is that the case? We really need to understand what's going on, and not just hope for keep doing the same thing and hope for better results. So what it reveals is some uncomfortable truths about leadership, and anybody who has read any of the 3 books realizes that the situation we're dealing with is a lot more complicated than meets the eye. And once you understand the details of what's really going on, then you can start to think about countermeasures. So what the books really do is they help you understand the current state of leadership. And people have made assumptions early on in the lean movement that they understood leaders and what they wanted and how they think, and that's not the case. And so the books explore that in great detail. So what's going on is when people realize the lean transformation isn't working out as planned and so forth, people cite numerous superficial reasons to explain the phenomenon that they're observing, and these are surface level phenomenon that they're seeing. The common one is fear of change, fear of the unknown. The leaders are risk averse. The leaders are not engaged, and so on. And all of these are absolutely true. But what is the reason for fear of change? What is the reason for leaders not engaged? And so you really have to drill down deeply to get to the bottom of what's actually going on here. And if we don't do that, then we're not going to have much success in the future. We'll just have these unicorns, these company here and there, a CEO who's willing to think and do things differently and so on, which is great. That does a lot of good things for the people that work in that company, good things for customers, and good things for investors, and hopefully good things for suppliers in the community as well. But we've really got to dig down much deeper. And so let me share with you in the next slide the evolution of progressive management. So let's start with the top. Yeah.
I was going to say, Bob, just let's use the fear bit as just one example of how knowing a bit more about psychology can really help to go that step further that you're talking about. When we go through our formative years, we are controlled by our significant carers, our parents, whoever it might be, and they do things like shout stop at us if we're going to run out in front of a car, okay, which is really, really harsh for us because we feel like we've done something wrong, and it leaves an experience in our brain that says we're not worthy, we've done something, we're not right. And what that's known in psychology terms is fear of failure and fear of rejection. And we carry that baggage into adulthood with us. So, when we are being judged, when we are being made to feel guilty by not hitting a KPI, we're tapping straight into really, really deeply imprinted fears. And the lower self-concept we've got, the more negatively we'll respond to that emotionally. And then that starts to shift glucose energy around in people's heads, and they can't think straight and do silly things and make mistakes. So, just it's a good example, I think, from a fear. And Deming noticed it, you know, before he come up with SOPK, he included at point 8 as drive out fear. And he ended up going to understanding more about what he then called theory of knowledge from an anarcha and whatever else point of view, but and psychology. So it's not like the people that are revered in the lean world haven't started to get in the same direction. It's just and again, I think I was paying a massive compliment once. I'm not sure how I took it, but a guy called Randy Schenkat that worked with Deming on SOPK, he said that I detailed with BTFA what Deming was looking for in SOPK before he passed away. So, you know, it's great point on fear. I just wanted to explode it a little bit and give people an example of how this stuff comes together if you know it. Sorry, mate, I'll let you crack on with the next slide now.
That's great. So let's have a look here. You have it in the purple arrow, the classical management, which is the way organizations are normally run, whether they're for-profit or non-profit business, and even in higher education and so on. These things are of ancient origin. Classical management is of ancient origin. But where does progressive management come from? Well, civil engineering is the oldest engineering profession, and out in the 1700s pops up mechanical engineering, and out of mechanical engineering comes industrial management and industrial engineering. And the ideas from the late 1800s and early 1900s feeds the development of something called Toyota's management system. And you can see in the red arrow, it moves forward. It's continuously evolving to this day and so on. And then in the 1980s, out pops a derivative of Toyota's management system called lean management. And what's notable about these classical management compared to these systems of progressive management, starting with particularly with Toyota's management, but also in the world of industrial management and industrial engineering, late 1800s, 1910, is, as you see at the bottom, classical management and the associated leadership routines. These are treated as non-technical disciplines in industry and in higher education. And the most important feature about this is classical management is rooted in preconceptions, whereas progressive management is rooted in perceptions. And so in progressive management, you learn and you make adjustments through trial and error, use a scientific method, and so on. And this is treated basically as a technical discipline. So in progressive management practice, management and leadership is treated as a technical discipline where you have to understand cause and effect and so on. And that is not the case so much for classical management. Yeah, you see it occasionally and so forth, but basically classical management is rooted in preconceptions. And so what I mean by perceptions is that you engage things with your senses, and you're learning through the interaction of your senses with the environment. David, I don't know if you or Emiel want to touch upon that, add a little something to that or not?
Yeah, what it reminds me of is the Carl von Clausewitz statement that no battle plan survives its first encounter with the enemy. You know, it's that whole classical kind of cause and effect, sequential thinking. Yeah. You know, if you start here, you've got to go through these 7 steps and end up there. But we know from, you know, massive amount of study into brains, how brains start to piece things together, and there's a complex algorithm that a company called Numenta identified many years ago now, called hierarchical temporal memory. And it helps the brain pull things together. It disseminates all the sensory information coming in, takes it apart, checks it if it's a threat against other things that you've experienced in the past, pulls it back together, and ends up producing meaning from all the different parts. So, you know, the way we learn is by trial and error. We learn by getting things wrong. We learn faster in the hard times than we do when things are easy.
And if you're penalized for getting things wrong by your boss, you don't engage in trial and error. You don't learn. The boss ignores causality. And so classical management is largely ignorant of causality, especially cumulative causality, which is why you see the same problems occurring over and over again in classically managed organizations.
Oh, do you know what? I've never thought of it before. We should have cumulative yield, but in terms of the effect that you have on people. So the further down the hierarchical chain, the command and control gets, the more shut down people are.
Absolutely, right. Yeah. So in the next image, what we have is how I've classified what preceded, or maybe what's better to said is long been in existence, is rule of thumb and guessing with respect to management. and classical management are born of these preconceptions. And then you have these evolution of the management system, not quite shown in the time sequence, but scientific management from the early 1900s, and from that Toyota management, and then lean management as well. And there is these are born of perceptions. Now, the problem is that economists and CEOs both share a similar perception that helps explain why we don't see as much, why lean hasn't proliferated the way we thought it would in organizations, is because the economists believe that the markets will ensure an efficient outcome regardless of the management system. So the market is ultimately the determinant of whether or not a company is successful or not, and whether and how they are led and how the company is managed, and those kind of details are immaterial. The market will make the decision. And CEOs share this preconception, which is why you see such uniformity with respect to classical management out there. It's like there's no need to do lean because it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's classical Keynesian macroeconomics, isn't it?
In terms of efficient market outcomes.
Yeah.
So, that's just one of.
Oh, have we got an internet connection? Oh, you're back, Bob. We lost you there for a second.
Yeah.
What would you say?
So anyway, go on to the next one.
Next slide, all right.
Yeah, just go. Yeah, could just go on to the next one. And so we know scientific thinking applies anywhere in the hierarchy of the organization. If you looked at the left side, the range of application of scientific is top scientific thinking. Trial and error is top to bottom. But what you really find in an organization is that around the point of the middle manager on up through the president or CEO, you have what I call a dead zone, which means that there's not much scientific thinking going on there. Instead, what you have is de jure thinking, which means by right. So basically, it's a situation where the boss, whether it's the mid-level manager, general manager, VP, president, or CEO, says, do it the way I tell you to do because I'm the boss. Do it this way because I told you so. Whereas lower in the organization, in the living zone where scientific thinking lives and has to live and thrive, it's de facto. People have to work using the facts of the matter that they're dealing with in producing whatever the product or service happens to be. And so the workers on the front line and their supervisor have to deal with the facts of the matter related to why the product is being made or not made, why there's a problem, a quality problem, the machine stopped, whatever the case may be. They have to deal with the facts, but that's not necessarily the case for what I call the dead zone. So if you can think of in the living zone, the 7 QC tools, 5 whys, trial and error and so forth, that all has to happen in the living zone, and the de jure and by right zone, that does not necessarily have to happen. And so the de jure zone is the world of preconceptions and how the business is run and so on.
And in the living zone, you have to use the facts, right? I mean, there's no way around it.
You have to deal with the facts. There is no way around that, but it's not the case. And everybody, you, me, everybody listening, we've all given a presentation to the vice president or president or CEO. We presented the facts, and then there's a clear decision that should be made based on the facts, and you find out that a decision was made regardless of the facts. Everybody has had that experience. So you wonder why, when you presented the facts so clearly, the decision appears to be this, you end up with a different decision. And so that's what's going on here. We've all experienced it. Any comments? Oh, we'll just move on. So what I tried to show in this picture is the system of preconceptions that exists. And in the work that I've done in those books and so on, you have preconceptions related to economic. So what you see in this picture are books, because preconceptions are usually somewhere at some point in time in the form of a book. They've been somehow documented as this is the right way to think. And so you have the spine of a book you're seeing here in the brown color. And you have economic preconceptions, social preconceptions, political preconceptions, historical preconceptions, philosophical, business, legal, and spiritual preconceptions. And what I'm trying to show here is a closed system. It just recirculates. These preconceptions, they're interconnected. they recirculate amongst themselves. They're flowing through themselves and so forth. And leaders basically resist or reject lean management because their world, their reality is based on a system of preconceptions rather than the fact-based reality. And we all know how much trouble we've had to try to get a general manager, vice president, president, or CEO to participate in Kaizen. They just won't do it. Not all, but most will not do that. And this is why there's this system of preconceptions that spans 8 different things. And this is why when you manage to make a good argument to a CEO why you should do lean, let's say you make an economic argument, the facts are clear and so forth, but the boss still says no, well, that's because you have not made any progress with respect to the social, political, historical, philosophical, business, legal, or spiritual preconceptions. You've only addressed the economic preconception. You may have addressed it successfully from the point of facts, but you have not addressed all of them. And so the boss says, no, thanks, still not interested. So
yeah, it doesn't reach the tipping point, does it? And again, for me, this is great because it looks like a bit of a wiring diagram, and it just reflects the wiring that's in people's heads. It's, like we said at the beginning, brains are a wiring network, and that wiring is triggered into creating itself through this neurogenesis process in response to the environment that individual's surviving and the cultural stance, set piece that exists in that culture. So all of these things are culturally relevant, and that's what forms people's worldview. And going on the shop floor and training tools and techniques doesn't change the way leaders think. And unfortunately, a couple of days worth of training about lean leadership and lean management isn't enough to overcome and change the wiring and firing patterns that are these preconceptions. So
and because of these preconceptions, lean is for the de facto work, the living zone. That's all. That's what
where the tools can be applied and you can get some results. And then what happens with the sustainability piece is the way the business is run, the approach that the managers take, the beliefs that they hold that inform their actions don't change. They just like the fact that the P&L's got better for that financial year, and then they carry on operating and functioning and treating people the same way, and eventually the system forces people to go backwards from where they were at, and this is why you get slippage in lean implementation programs.
And on the other end,
reinforces
this system of preconceptions, right? If you initial success somehow, I mean, if you can act as a leader with this system of preconceptions and you get the progress, then there's still no need to change or something, right? There's no trigger to change that.
No, they've been in control of a project that's been successful as far as the Excel sheet says.
Yeah, you can think of this as also representing the status quo. The system of preconceptions represents the status quo, which we'll talk about in the next slide. It's people don't realize the strength and power of the status quo. So what the dark gray circle shows is system T, where T stands for tradition. And tradition stems from 17th century economic, legal, political, and social theory, which is encompasses liberation from feudalism, which is a great thing. Glad that happened. Glad that we had the moral philosophers and the political of the 17th century and the political economists of the 18th century and the Age of Enlightenment. Good stuff. But what times have changed. It's moral philosophy going back to the late 1600s. Times have changed. Things are different. What you have in subsystem CM is classical management, which operates within system T very comfortably. And there you have a little white dot at the top called subsystem LM, which is lean management, or Toyota's management system, which operates within system T, successfully so, but it nevertheless has to contend with the status quo that surrounds it on a daily basis. And leaders basically like the way things are, so their job is to essentially conserve what is now parts of which, anyway, not completely, but parts of which are obsolete rather. But it's really strong and powerful, and people just when the boss rejects something and sticks to the status quo, they just scratch their head in a sort of superficial way and not really understanding what's going on at a deep level as to why these things are rejected.
Yeah, but doesn't that link straight back into sort of, like you say, that historical differentiation as well? Because I mean, let's face it, through the, I mean, you had the what is it, Edo and Yayoi periods that led up to the Tokugawa period in Japan, which was from what, mid 1600s through to late 1800s, early 1900s, before the Tokugawa dynasty kind of moved on. But that was where they got rid of feudalism as well. And then in the 1800s, you know, with the Spanish arriving and things, chose to start to I don't know, exist on a trading platform with the rest of the world. And then obviously the Russian invasion in the early 1900s, 1903, made them rethink their military strategy, which got them sending people off to the States and Harvard to learn about shipbuilding, bringing things back. It crashed in and coincided with Lillian Gilbreth as an industrial psychologist going over there, having a huge impact on management thinking, but from a much more Shinto religious background, you know, different evolutionary background, culture, and the response was to put, you know, people like Horikome who taught Shingo through that management process of a 3-month intensive 12-hour day management session through MITI and the JMI. So, you know, and this is it's a different history, it's a different backdrop to management thinking that led to TPS and the evolution of TPS than we had in the rest of the world. So, you know, everything you've just said there makes perfect sense if you take into account that evolutionary in that tiny island of Japan, you know, in amongst everything else.
Yeah. So what's, you know, that's part of what's really going on here. Let's compare. You have on the right, everybody knows Toyota's management house, and it should be more or less familiar with the details. But I've added a couple of things here at the base. I put de facto foundation, and then in the center it says 90% de facto. Don't take the number 90% as being based in you know, a scientific measurement and so forth. But we know from observation, we also know from experience, you know, when I was trained by Shingijutsu consultants and so forth, that the management system is mostly fact-based. And facts are very important for decision making in Toyota's management world. But in classical management, we have different goals here compared to Toyota management. We have different pillars here, ownership and control. We have different things at the foundation, and ultimately de jure is the foundation, and we make decisions by right rather than by facts. And of course, sometimes facts are part of the decision making in making a decision by right. But usually what happens is the decisions that are made by right, even if they incorporate some facts, it's usually not much in the way of facts, and the decisions that are made may ensure survival for a moment, but ultimately they'll lead to some cascade of larger poor decision making that'll put the company into a lot of trouble. You know, Boeing would be an example of de jure decision making that went on for a number of years that led to numerous problems there. So, you know, this is extremely important to recognize the difference that antiquated classical management is built from preconceptions and modern Toyota management is built from perceptions. And to shift leaders from preconceptions to perceptions is extremely difficult. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But Emiel or David, do you have any thoughts on that slide?
Emiel, I've done most of the talking. I'll let you get a word in edgeways, mate. No, it makes a lot of sense, Bob. It does. It's it is exactly what we see. But I think for me, again, the goal you could almost put alongside beliefs. And I mean, I've said for a long time, you know, the logical side of things, the tools approach to project management is 20%. It's the 80-20 Pareto rule. You know, beliefs and people and how they respond to that is the other 80% of change. So to see, you know, the goals, which means the philosophical objectives of leaders because of what they believe in being highest quality, lowest cost, shortest lead times, you know, and again, for me, this links into stuff like Hoshin Kanri, where you've got, as I had it explained to me, the accuracy, I can't, you know, claim is there, but the way I've understood it is the time-based language that was chosen to highlight 3 major timelines or value streams was order to cash, raw materials, and to finished goods, and concept to launch. You know, and when you've got those kind of things as the focal point that everybody's aligned to, that's very different from the cultural layer type separation you get across a hierarchy when the people at the top are looking after the legal issues, the profits, and the people on the shop floor are looking after the day-to-day production issues.
And the reason why the alignment works is because the alignment through Hoshin Kanri is based on facts.
Yeah, but it's also done from a philosophical position because out of a respect for humanity. It's like, what can we do to make sure the people are okay, know where they're going back to Toyota Kata, have got direction, have got tangible goals that they've had inclusion into developing so that there's no imposed control. There's lots of psychology built into the Hoshin Kanri methodology.
And when the facts make sense to people, there is an emotional connection.
Yeah, that's when we get into the HR buzzwords like empowerment, ownership, autonomy, all those kind of things, motivation. These are all neuro responses to the conditions leaders create.
We've all listened to leaders who would give a talk and say a bunch of nonsense, and afterwards everybody goes back to their desk, and on the way back it's like, what a bunch of nonsense. The facts are wrong, so people don't emotionally connect to it in a positive way. They connect to it in a negative way and say, we don't like our leader. They're not saying this, but essentially, we don't like our leader, we don't trust our leader doesn't know what they're talking about.
Yeah, and again, just
that's something else, right? Yeah. I mean, because if we talk about facts, it's not just the facts, it's also the logic that you connected the different parts of it. So there is also a logical part. So if you say that you don't trust the leader because he doesn't understand, the understanding is not so much about the facts, but about causality or the logic behind.
Yes.
So it's bigger than just the facts, I think.
I think again, I've got
understanding of what's going on.
Sorry, Emiel. Why I laughed so much when Bob said that is I've got a particular very strong memory of being in a boardroom and like everybody sitting on desks and crammed in, like 150 people in this room that's designed for 30, and having the big announcement, and it was all done from a financial perspective with all the charts and graphs and everything. And the finance director gave the presentation, and there was quite a long restrictive corridor, and you just heard this buzz of talking as everybody left, and I was in amongst a couple of different groups of people that were chatting amongst themselves, and they all going, what the hell was that about? I didn't have a bloody clue what those slides were talking to us about. It was like
they make the terrible assumption that people understand what they're saying. And I always would tell people, train students in university, that when I would tell bosses that when people that you're speaking to are nodding their head, that doesn't mean they understand. That means they want you to hurry up and get done. We don't care what you have to say. We don't agree. We just wanted this to be over because we don't understand it. So the nodding head is deceptive. It doesn't mean what you think it means.
All right.
We need. Let's do the last couple of slides and then we can.
Yeah, I was going to say we need to take a time check. This is gone.
This question of Ile.
Oh yeah, what's that?
It comes a kind of a metrics, right? But is there a difference in belief in the data zoning of Asia and in the Western world?
Ooh.
That refers to
I think there is. I think that's no, I go to the book slide actually, because I think that one, because I think it's on the right hand side. It's embedded within the spiritual. Maybe I'll answer the question this way. So these three books focus on the preconceptions, and specific ones you can see at the bottom, and believe is going to be, interfacing with all of those different preconceptions, and Toyota is a unique case in terms of how they think about things. It's not the way all Japanese managers or Japanese companies think about things. So it's hard to there's a lot of companies, most companies globally are in the mode of classical management, especially over the last 50 years. So I don't know.
I think Ellie, if I can answer Ellie's question in a different way, there's a lot of experiments being done now with people in functional MRI scanners, magnetic resonance imaging, where you get to see the blood flows in the brain as it's active, and it pretty much gives a pretty robust indication of what parts of the brain are being used when they're dealing with different subjects. And there's been some studies that show a Western brain, typical, whether it's US or UK, whatever, or European, and a Japanese brain being presented with the same logical problem solving task, and the fMRI scan shows that the Western brain will route that problem much more through the left hemisphere, which is the logical basis and calculation part of the brain, and the Japanese will go through the more sort of pictorial, representative. And I think a lot of it comes down to pictograms and ideograms being used in Japanese language, and pictures speaking 1,000 words, that kind of stuff. But but also the religious backdrop, the spiritual side of it, what people fundamentally believe culturally has an impact on the way the brain forms and the way that brain will deal with problems. So I think, that inevitably, Ellie, there's a difference in the way people's brains work, which we can consider the belief word, between East and West to some extent, but it varies, of course, and it's different between families, factories, and nations.
Mm-hmm.
Anything more to this slide, Bob?
Excuse me?
More to this slide? Do you want to?
Yeah, just go to onto the next one, I think, and we'll wrap it up, or continue, but we don't need to look at slides anymore. Anyway, Deming's work was wonderful. It was unfinished. He passed away, and as David said, he added a lot to the psychology of it all to explain Deming's system of profound knowledge. And the reality is the facts enable progress, and I think that's what Deming was trying to get at, was we have to be fact-based in order to make progress, and the system of profound knowledge is based upon understanding the facts, the logic of the situation, and so forth. And the books that I've written construct the system of profound privilege, and it explains how these preconceptions obstruct progress. And the unfortunate reality is the system of profound privilege is far stronger than the system of profound knowledge. And when you try to introduce the system of profound knowledge into the system of profound privilege, these are antagonistic to one another, and the system of profound privilege wants to eject the system of profound knowledge, or will accept only some pieces of it that don't cause problems to the system of profound privilege and upset the status quo.
Something just popped into my head when you started that, Bob, was the fact-based is very factual, and people stuff nearly always becomes the airy-fairy, soft and fluffy HR, whatever else it's branded with. When you put the science to it, that becomes fact as well. I think what's important to point out is that when we deal with fact, it doesn't just mean facts because you can measure a lump of metal and what diameter is and what 6 sigma variance you get. Right. The facts are human beings have got brains, and brains work in generically similar ways, and you will get responses if you do things. That's factual too. We can start with the onset of neuroscience. We can do something with that now.
Yes, the facts have to resonate with the emotional and make the connection to human. Human work, human existence, human progress.
Yeah, definitely.
Yep. Let's see. Emiel Martin had a question here about what are the change in circumstances?
Yeah, I want to address that later on.
Okay.
It's just in the next slide, but I've been seeing it, and I want to address that one as well. Indeed, I think this concludes the introduction of both areas of research, right? And we already started making the connection. And this is a slide that came out of the work that David and I did together in 2018. And it links exactly in this environmental dimensions that the question is about, that I will show shortly. But if you think about the BTFA model, which is very more simplistic here as in a more linear fashion, if you have interactions with people, then there are two brains involved, right? At least. And if you think about belief, things, and feeling, that's more on the inside, and somehow that triggers an action that will add to the environment. And what the other person takes out of that from the environment through the perception, through the senses, feeds back into the internal part of the BTFA from the receiver on the other side. Right? So you get this interaction, and the interaction is very much through the environment. We are talking now and using the environment of air and all this technology to get something from one head into the other head, and vice versa. So environment is the usually important aspect, I think, to understand the BTFA model at work. And Language has been mentioned already a few times. But Dave, maybe you can introduce the other 4 ones as well.
Yeah, so originally, again, this was work from a friend of mine called Ken. We worked together before we worked on it, Emiel. He took it to a certain level. Originally, it was the press model. It was the physical, risk, emotional, social, and systemic. But
And yet the EU as well.
our work took it on a step, I think, and it's the physical is the physical environment that, because again, just to give an example, if you're working in a really loud environment, high noise causes the brain to release stressor hormones like cortisol, and cortisol does all sorts of nasty things. It depletes brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which allows brains to adapt and all sorts of stuff. So the physical environment has a big impact on the mental state of people. So that's to be considered. And also the cultural differentiation, from top floor to shop floor. If you're sitting around a walnut boardroom drinking filter coffee, that's a lot different from being on a machine turning red hot lumps of swarf that you're trying to dodge, So you end up
or
with
different canteens or whatever, yeah.
Yeah, a separate canteen. Yeah, we had that conversation the other day, didn't we? I worked for a company once where the board of directors actually detached themselves behind palm trees, separated themselves from the canteen, and had a special menu that nobody else could access. So, this is that historical, what does good look like, that comes from the preconceptions Bob's talking about. And it manifests itself in the physical environment. The risk is what we perceive. We've all got, like I said earlier, hierarchical temporal memory, interacts with a thing called sparse networks and how that all works in the brain as the neurons degenerate and stuff. But the amount of risk, it comes back to that fear of failure, fear of rejection, our own levels of self-concept, how we perceive ourselves in the world, how we perceive others, whether we've got an internal or external locus of control. All of this is how we determine risk. And the way leaders treat us triggers that a lot, and how we treat people as leaders, I should say, as well. So socially, it's about relations. This is where George Emiel did a lot of his work about relations, how people relate to each other and the workplace, and how leaders trigger relationship responses. And again, HR originally didn't mean human resources. George Emiel coined the phrase, and it stood for human relations, and it's just been bastardized over the years and reduced to another transactional type consideration. Control is imposed control, systemic control. It's like, when we say system says no, computer says no, you'll never get the system to let you do it, Bob?
Right. System won't let you do it.
Yeah. So, imposed control and people's perceptions of that imposed control, which links into risk, is all there to be considered. And for me, this is why Hoshinkanri is such a brilliant model when you can look at it through this lens, because it does deal with the sociological construct of feedback and communication in timely manner, and the degree of inclusion that I think got rebadged as catchball when it became policy deployment and become an X-matrix based approach. It deals with all these things in its construct, because it's done from a premise of respect for humanity. But language is such a powerful thing psychologically. Let's give an example. Yeah, but means at the beginning of a sentence means, okay, I'm nodding and I'm smiling, like Bob said earlier, but I'm dismissing everything you're saying because I'm right and I'm waiting to get my chance to speak. And you should quite often, depending on its context, implies guilt. So you should have been here on time means I'm right, you're wrong. And that can come from a position of insecurity rather than confidence. And you find a lot of leaders get promoted out of their comfort zone, so they find themselves fundamentally insecure. So the language they employ is one of defensive blame and projection rather than inclusion, and all of this manifests itself and creates the culture of the company. So the environmental dimensions in those 5 points there are the ones we've settled on after many, many years of deeply thinking about it and deciding what ones we should, it's not the only ones that are there and are involved, but it's the ones that I think leaders can choose to most easily do something about.
This may be a nice trigger to put up Martijn's question here. What about changes in circumstances? Was firstly addressed to you, Bob. As we are experiencing right now, in my experience, companies go to panic mode instead of using what they learned from the practices of the last few years. And if you I was reading this question about circumstances, and I was thinking, hey, circumstances has something to do with environment. That's why I was thinking this would be a good moment to address this question.
Well, I think that one of the true tests of a company who is learning or has learned and continues to learn lean management well is to not go backwards in times of crisis, to continue to apply the principles and practices that people have learned and further build upon that and accumulate more knowledge and skill and capability building off of that. There's some evidence that I've seen of organizations on the internet that have continued to apply lean well in the COVID-19 era. And there are, of course, others that will just go back to doing what they've done in the past in a time of crisis. But
yeah.
That's a good test.
Yeah, I think if you look at the word panic, that has something to do with the risk assessment, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the physical risk could be, in this sense, the corporate body.
Well, the other thing to be conscious of here is we use language quite loosely, especially in English. Different languages have to have more precision. Companies go to panic mode, right? There's no such thing as a company, as far as I'm concerned, or an organization. People go to panic mode because people panic. Companies don't. So, if we're going to think about what it means to have a fear-based response to changing circumstance, then we've got to think about where the leader's at. What is it that they're scared of? Is it, whatever, not being able to give people their jobs in the next month? That's a very real risk for a lot of people, and coming to bear already for many. So, a lot of, we talk about leaders, and quite often it might sound like we're positioning them as if it's a negative thing being a leader, or we look at them negatively. That's not the case. I meet so many people that are genuinely got concern for their employees, that they're in work because they want to create jobs, they want to contribute to the economy. And when you've got these changing circumstances, it is scary for everybody, and leaders are humans too, so if it seems like companies are panicking, it's probably because they are. What we can do in terms of resilience and flexibility and capacity to respond is get people more used to change and get their brains to rewire and fire differently around risk and around testing and around continuous improvement, because then when things like this come at us from the sidelines, then we're in a better position mentally to cope.
Yeah, if you're used to doing Kaizen regularly on a daily basis, individually, and frequently in a team-based environment, then you know what to do when the crisis occurs. You've been trained in that. You now have the knowledge and the methodologies and the creative mindset to address the crisis.
Yeah, it's like any brain training.
I think there's another point that we need to address, David. Once you experience risk, once you get in stress mode, you get this very difficult word about not being able to use your cortex. Maybe you can talk a little bit to that.
Yeah, I think it's there's so much that you go into neuroscientifically around that stuff.
Because,
very simply, what we're talking about is the prefrontal cortex. The brain runs on glucose energy that we derive from carbohydrates and ketones in our foodstuffs, right? So if we're in panic mode, all of the glucose energy goes to the amygdala, which means we haven't got as much available for the prefrontal cortex, the executive function. So we don't. Our capacity to think rationally is reduced when our body state and our homeostasis is upset by fear, because it's taking glucose energy to the wrong places around the brain. That's the simple version. There's a hell of a lot more to it than that, but
yeah, there's a lot more to say. But I hope this gives more time some clues about how we think about these kinds of subjects.
Yeah, guys, can we do a time check? I think we need. I'm going to have to shoot in a little while, but it's.
Let's proceed. So we had this environmental dimensions, and what happened? Because David and I worked on this for 2018, and then I started reading Bob's work, and I think, hey, system of preconceptions sounds like beliefs to me. So if you then put these 8 dimensions of beliefs there, then you get some kind of, I start merging things, right? So what's happening then is that, okay, if you take the BTFA model, then on the left there is the system of preconceptions that do all kinds of stuff in within people internally, and somehow that creates a manifestation in the environment, the physical. And I think this is an interesting model to explore further in future editions. How this works, and I think there's a lot to it to better understand what the beliefs that both the leader have, but also the followers, and how that interaction, that relation between a leader and a follower acts out in the environment. So, anything to that from your side?
I'm going to reserve any other further comments because I'm looking at the timeline and I'm getting worried I'm going to be late for my next appointment. So sorry,
right,
I don't want to rush this at the end, but I've got other commitments. So
let's wrap it up. So from there, we created some homework for everybody for following us, and this is a worksheet that on the left you see the 8 dimensions that comprise the system of preconceptions that Bob has been investigating, and in blue you see the 5 environmental dimensions. This is a worksheet that we will send to you if you leave your details below. Enough for that. Let's see. So if you leave your details, we will send this out to you with some instructions, and we will hope that you will send it back to us, so then we can have a conversation based on your input.
That'd be great. It's fantastic to see if we can get the people that are listening in and listen, to the recording thereafter to drop us their email and get this back to us in the next week or so. I'd love to see what people think, how it comes together or doesn't, and we can pick that up next time round and discuss what we found and what people have put into it.
Yeah.
Right.
So those of you that are willing to try to fill this out, refer back to your first slide that showed the follower out on the plank and the leader's the leader on the plank and the follower is basically supporting the leader. So the question is why do followers stay on the plank? Why do we support leaders that have these preconceptions that support the status quo and so forth? Why do we as followers why don't we look for better leaders? And so Emiel brings, I think, a hugely important perspective to our work in terms of examining this from a follower's perspective.
Yeah, definitely.
So we have 2 more episodes planned already. Next one will be on the 5th of June. The next one after that on the 19th of June. 5th of June, we plan to share with you a different model that David developed. So you have a little over a week to share your thoughts on this sheet with us. And then the 19th, we will address your input. Please send it a few days before, so we have time to examine it, craft new episode from it. I guess for now, these are the instructions that you will get if you leave your details. Some more input.
Yeah,
I think we will leave it here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, leave it there. People can always pause it there, then, can't they? And then use the image to help them think.
Yeah, that's the board, the plank that we're referring to.
Yeah. So I hope this was interesting for you, and hope to see you soon and see your comments as well.
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed it, and great getting together with you guys and the folks who tuned in. Appreciate it. Hope
thanks for your time, everybody out there. Yeah, really enjoyed this thoroughly, and really looking forward to the next one. We'll be talking about ADAPT, which is a change management model, building on the psychology stuff on the next one round, and then we'll come back to this in the last show. Yeah. So good.
All right.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Cheers, guys. Yeah. See you next time. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.